All right, so if the epidemiology of substance use is trying to figure out who is using what, when, and where, um, let's give you some of that background information. Now, I want to start with a relative success story. It's not a complete success story, but it's a relative success story, and that's with tobacco smoking. So in 1990, give me a little break here, not that long ago, over a third of men in the world and over 8% of the women in the world were regular smokers. That is a large percentage of the world's population were regular smokers. 25 years later, we've reduced the prevalence of smoking among men down to 25%, and it's much lower in some countries, as you can see on the map over on the right of the screen. And the smoking rate among women is now only about 5.5%. We've reduced that by 30, 40%. 40% more so in the case of men. So tobacco smoking has had its successes in many, many countries. There's been coordinated efforts using the epidemiology of tobacco use to implement better and stronger policies because of the epidemiology. That's why those policies were actually able to be put in place. How about alcohol use? We know if we know about a quarter of all men, 5.5% of all women are smokers. How about alcohol use? Well, it's a little bit surprising. Now, there is wide geographic variability, but the majority of people in the world and the majority of people in many sections of the world actually aren't drinkers. The proportion of people who are abstainers, who have never had a drink in their life, is actually larger than the people who have actually had a drink in their entire life, which is somewhat surprising. You would think with all the alcohol that all the alcohol attributable harm and all the cause and the treatments that we have for alcohol, you would think it would kind of be more people who actually drink, but in fact that's not the case. And more so, among the people who drink, most people are relatively healthy drinkers. They only have a drink once in a while. They stay within recommended guidelines. It's actually a relatively small number of people who are heavy drinkers, or in this case on the screen, who are binge drinkers. So out of all people who drink, maybe only 20%, 15 to 20% on average are actually heavy episodic drinkers, which translate into something from 0 to 15% in the entire population. So less than 50% of the entire world drinks, and less than 25% of all drinkers are actually dangerous, hazardous drinkers, who are, in this case, binge drinkers. There is also wide geographic variation in terms of what type of alcohol is being used. Now, this is just the United States. This isn't the world. But we do see fairly large variations in terms of the type of alcohol being consumed by each state. So we have beer, spirits, wine, and then people who binge drink. It seems like beer is mostly consumed in the highest states that it's consumed in terms of pints per day. Northern states, so North Dakota, New Hampshire. Darker states like Montana and South Dakota, more rural areas. When we talk about spirits, we do see darker colors up in that northern Midwest area, but Wisconsin, Nevada seems to be pretty high. Florida is also a lot darker. Wine tends to be more on the coasts rather than the center of the country, so California, New England, again, Florida. And then it seems like our binge drinking problems are really either in the Midwest or kind of New England region, so Massachusetts and Rhode Island kind of light up. So I put this up here just to demonstrate that there is wide geographic variability with alcohol use in terms of what people are actually consuming and how much. Now, regarding other substances, so tobacco and alcohol use are the most prevalent types of psychoactive substances used in the world. Only about 5% of the world's population have used an illicit drug, in this case in 2015. That's a relatively small proportion. So 25% of men are smokers, less than half the world are drinkers, but you're still talking about 45% of the world are drinkers, at least one drink in the last year. Only 5% of the world's population used an illicit drug, essentially in the last year. Now, throughout all regions, marijuana is the most prevalently used substance used in each region. And that, I completely admit that was a terrible sentence. Let me say that again. Marijuana is the most used substance in every region of the world, illicit substance used in every region of the world. worldwide, there are about 180 million people who use cannabis on at least a yearly basis. Now, that second most prevalent drug is going to vary by region. So the second most used drug in North America, in the United States, and Canada is not necessarily going to be the same as the second most used drug in Southeast Asia or Australia or Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America. So that's where you get a lot of variability. Now, overall, again, marijuana, cannabis is the most used illicit substance, but you do have larger numbers of people using the opioids, whether it's prescription opioids or non-prescription opioids, as well as amphetamines. Those are kind of the top two overall worldwide. But just like alcohol, a very small of these illicit drug users are actually problematic users. They may have just tried it once, or they only use one of these substances on occasion, but they're not dependent. They don't actually have an addiction. So of that 5%, only about 11.5% are actually problematic drug users, which works out to about 0.4% of the world's population. A very, very low percent of the world's population are actually problematic drug users. Now, they're problematic because they actually account for the majority of the substances consumed. So although they are a small number of people, they actually have a disproportionate burden of the consequences of substance use because they consume so much. Now, in the US, we currently have an opioid epidemic. There is a large number of people in the United States who have become addicted to opioids primarily through the prescription drug programs. They were prescribed an opioid to relieve their pain from whatever reason. They got addicted, and then they've maintained that addiction by using pills for illegal purposes or acquiring heroin through illicit means. But this epidemic is largely a US phenomenon. We really don't see this epidemic anywhere else in the world. And here's one example of how a few number of people can use a lot of a substance. So America in general, it's a large country. There are a lot of people in the US, but we really only make up about 5% of the world's population. There are about 330 million people in the US right now. But we consume 80% of the entire supply of prescription painkillers in the world, even though we make up only 5% of the population. And really, this 80% of consumption is coming out of only about 2.5 million opioid users in the United States. So a small number of people consuming a very large quantity of one type of substance. Now, among ways to consume a substance, injection drug use is by far the most dangerous. We worry about injection drug users the most. And the problematic drug users, a lot of them actually do end up injection drug use at some point in time. So there are about almost 12 million adults in the world who were injection drug users in 2015. Now, if the problematic drug users in the world are about 0.4% of the world's population, the injection drug users are about 0.25% of the population. That's why I said that, or that's why I think that the problematic drug users are simply much more likely to be injection drug users in general. But again, just like everything else, there are wide regional variations in how substances are consumed and the prevalence of injection drug use. So in general, what are the big takeaways from this module? In general, men are more likely to use alcohol and other substances than women. There is one exception to this, and this is the non-medical use of prescription drugs, where they're about even. Men and women are equally likely to use prescription drugs for non-medical use. Men are more likely to be problematic drug users than women, although the gap is shrinking in many areas of the world. Now, the question is, and the question remains, is the gap shrinking because men are becoming less men are becoming problematic drug users, or is the gap shrinking because more women are becoming problematic drug users? The former would be a very good thing for addiction science and public health. The latter would be a very dangerous thing for addiction science and public health. And then finally, young and middle-aged adults are most likely to be problem drug users. They have the most access to the resources, but there is also something of a kind of a survival effect where the problematic drug users do have lower mortality, lower life expectancy, and don't necessarily live to in as greater numbers to older age.